Hello, and welcome, not to a game, but to a video. This is Why Does Everyone Hate Dark Souls 2 by Joe Joe Gella. I don't know how to pronounce that, but by Joe. And this is a video that came out a few weeks ago, but I stumbled into earlier today. And he just talks about Dark Souls 2, some of the problems it has, and I wanted to take a look at it and go through the video point by point and just talk about some of the things that I agree with, some of the things that I disagree with, because there were a lot of points that he made where I could see where he was coming from, but I disagreed with him, or that I think he misunderstood the game. That being said, in the part that I skipped, we're at 218, he talked about how he platinumed the game. I have played through the game once, didn't even beat it, so who knows, maybe I'm the one who misunderstands the game. But I have friends who love this series and love this game specifically and talk about this game a lot to me and have tried to convince me to play it. And I've gained some knowledge from them and what they've talked about. So don't take my word as a law. I'm just here to bring a different perspective. With that being said, don't expect React content to be a normal thing that I do. This is just a one-time thing because I saw the video and watched it and went, he makes some good points, but there's a lot that I disagree with here. With that being said, I'm going to full screen it. I just had it at not full screen so you could see the name. And I'm watching at 1.5 times speed, partially because time reasons, partially because I watch things at 1.5 times speed. And finally, I don't know the rules too well, so if I'm breaking any rules, I'm sorry, please let me know. I'll have no problem taking the video down. I don't want to steal content or anything like that. I don't want to break any rules. I'm gonna try to avoid that. But if I do accidentally, please let me know. But with that being said, we can watch this and I will go through my thoughts on his points one at a time.
The question we can answer is why people don't like this game. And to do that, I'm going to be splitting this video up into 3 sections: new game mechanics, and then large and small scale level design. And for each of these areas, there's both good and bad. But the bad...
Now, I appreciate, 1, the visual, 2, that he's going to go over the good stuff. What I disagree with that, like the part where I disagree with that, is breaking things up into just good and bad. Because there are some things where it's a double-edged sword, where there's some good, there's some bad, and then there's some things where it's not good or bad, it's just something that's changed, and that's just a decision that was made, and it's more of a neutral decision. And then there are some things where it's not really good or bad, it's more of a subjective thing. So, just going good, bad, good for simplicity, but not good for accuracy. And I feel like it would have been better to make 3 different columns. 1 for good, 1 for bad, 1 for other. For things that are neutral, things that are subjective, things that are double-edged swords, that have some good and some bad to them. But continuing on.
is much bigger. Now, I'm including the good because I have to give this game credit where it's due, because there are some things that this game did that were so good that they kept it moving forward and are now the standards that we know and love today. So
we're gonna come back to that multiple times, where he says standard. Standard, in my mind, means pretty much everything does it, but there are several times that he brings that up, or he talks about a game mechanic, where it's only shown in Dark Souls 2, or it only reappears in Elden Ring. But I do appreciate that he's adding the good just to balance things out for the video.
Let's start with that in the new game mechanics that are good. And for a lot of this video, I'm going to be referencing Dark Souls 1 because that game set the expectations. So I have this.
That is completely fair. And he goes through these, and like I said, we can take them on one by one. There are some things where he puts them on screen but says that he's not going to talk about them. I'll pause the video and go through those one by one in my response to them.
This massive list in OneNote here, which kind of looks very scary, but we're going to go through it and everything's going to be okay, I promise. So the first thing we're going to talk about, teleporting between bonfires. This is absolutely awesome, dude.
One, yes. Two, no. This is one of those things where I said, hey, double-edged swords. Because you might think, oh, well, being able to teleport straight from the beginning of the game, that's obviously a good thing. It adds so much convenience, there's less backtracking, yada yada yada. It's just a nice quality of life change for the player, which is correct. That is a good thing. The bad thing is that it makes it to where the game devs don't have to think as much about the world design being how every level connects into one another. To give an example, and this is a bit of an extreme example, but still, in Dark Souls 1, Firelink Shrine connects to, I believe, 9 or 10 areas. It connects to the Northern Undead Asylum through the Crow. It connects to Undead Burg. It connects to Lower Undead Burg. It connects to the Depths through the Lower Undead Burg. It connects to the Catacombs. It connects to New Londo Ruins. It connects to the Valley of Drakes through New Londo Ruins. It connects to Blighttown through the Valley of Drakes. It connects to the Undead Parish through the elevator shortcut. So it connects to a lot of different areas. And the reason for that, at least partially, is because there was no teleporting. And the game developers, because there was no teleporting, were forced to think about how you would get from Area A to Area B, and Area A could be anywhere in the game, at least for up until Sen's Fortress, and Area B could be anywhere in the game up until Sen's Fortress. And that's part of why, not the entire reason, but part of why the second half of Dark Souls 1 just kind of crumbles and falls apart, because that's when you get the Lord Vessel. That's when you get the ability to teleport, and then you then get 3 different paths to go, and they're all just straight lines that end in dead ends. And he will come back to this later in the video, I remember. I don't have any notes, I don't have a script or anything. I just watched it once earlier today, and I'm going by memory, but he brings up a bad later on where he talks about how the world design, or like how you move through the game, is just completely garbage in Dark Souls 2. And yeah, that's partially because of the no teleporting. And so if there was, like, if you just took Dark Souls 2 as it is and took out the teleporting feature in the first half, things would be so much worse. But if from step 1, when there was no game at all, and they just started developing day 1, if they went with the decision to not add teleporting right from the very beginning, Dark Souls 2 would probably look very different, and the world design would probably be a lot better because they would have been forced to think about that the way they did in Dark Souls 1. Continuing on.
Could teleport between any bonfire you want, assuming you've first activated it, right from the start of the game. In Dark Souls 1, you had to play through like 75% of the game before you could teleport, and even then, it was only possible between select bonfires. So this is a huge upgrade. The next thing is that...
Again, Dark Souls 1, because you didn't have teleporting at the very beginning, they were forced to think about that, and that's part, not the entire reason, but part of why the first half of Dark Souls 1 is so tightly designed and why everyone loves it and why it's incredible. And then once you hit Anor Londo and get the ability to teleport, things just kind of crumble. Again, part of the reason, not the whole reason.
Estus Flask upgrade system, and this is the same exact system that we have in.
So here he says 2 types of upgrades, number of uses, and potency of uses. Just remember that.
Elden Ring today. I'm talking about 2 types of upgrades for your flask. One that upgrades the number of uses, and one that upgrades the potency of each use. And again, I think this is a huge upgrade over what Dark Souls 1 had, because there was only one upgrade material, and you could either
This is just objectively incorrect.
use it to upgrade the potency of the flask, or to upgrade a specific bonfire to give you more flasks.
So, what he's talking about here is Firekeeper Souls, which increase the amount of health you get per Estus, like the potency. And he says that as if it's the only one, but he also claims that you need to use that to either gain potency or gain the amount of flasks that you get at a single bonfire. But that's just objectively incorrect. You use humanity to increase the number of Estus you get at a bonfire. And that point is the first thing where I went, wait, hold up. The first time watching it. So, yeah.
Next thing is dual wielding. We also have this in Elden Ring. You need to have 1.5 times the stat requirements to do this, but I just think it's an absolutely sick addition. Next thing, Twin Blade.
So, I'm going to lump these two in together. Let's go back to when he talked about how some things in Dark Souls 2 were so good that they became the standard. These are 2 things that I agree are good, but they aren't standard. Like, after Dark Souls 2, there was Bloodborne, which doesn't have dual wielding, doesn't have twin blades. And then you have Dark Souls 3, doesn't have dual wielding, doesn't have twin blades. It's only once you get to Elden Ring that it brings these 2 things back.
This is a weapon that they carried over into Elden Ring. Don't know why it skipped Dark Souls 3, but it did for some reason. Next thing we have here, life gems. These are basically healing items. They're not like a huge deal, but it's pretty cool to just have these.
He says not a huge deal. Again, I haven't played Dark Souls 2 nearly as much as him. But from what I've heard from other people, from friends, and from what I remember in my one playthrough, these were a massive deal. Like, people that I've listened to and friends that I've talked to have talked about how these kind of break the game, and they, not your Estus Flask, are your main source of healing, at least in combat. And so, him saying they're not a big deal kind of threw me off. Though maybe it's just his playstyle.
On hand in a pinch. Next thing that we have here is absolutely huge, and I'm talking about.
But yeah, I do agree with that. Life gems, I mean, I'd say that it's more of a mixture of a subjective and kind of a double-edged sword. But I'd say that there's more good than bad to that. So I'll agree with it.
Stat respect. We had this in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, but this is where it started.
Yeah, having it in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, so 2 of the 3 Soulsborne games after, I don't count Sekiro, because it's just fundamentally different in my eyes. But having it in 2 of the 3 games, I'm willing to concede that that could be considered standard. And so, even though Bloodborne doesn't have it, we can say that that's standard, and I do think it's a good thing.
Works just like Elden Ring. You find these items called soul vessels in various locations, and then you take them somewhere and you can respec your character. It's exactly the same thing. The next thing is Pharos Lockstone / Fragrant Branch of Yore. Basically, these 2 items are both.
And he says, like Stone Sword Keys in Elden Ring, this is another thing where it's not standard. It wasn't a thing in Bloodborne, wasn't a thing in Dark Souls 3. Though, we will come back to these, because he makes a point later on that I think has to do with these. But yeah, Elden Ring brought them back. I think they're a good thing.
Keys that open respective doors. Now, the only issue I had with this system was that there's like 20 times more doors than there are keys, and you.
Oh, good, he brought it up here. So, something that I'm going to bring up when we get into the bad is I think Dark Souls 2 was going for a feeling of despair. I think the game wanted you to feel despair. And there's a lot of things that go into this, and this is one of them. Having more Like having more locked doors than keys to unlock them, I think feeds into that feeling of despair. But so I think there's a reason for that, but I do prefer the way Elden Ring does it of having more keys than doors.
You never know if you're wasting the key or if you're using the key to unlock a crucial bonfire that would save you a massive amount of time. So that was a little bit overwhelming, but it's whatever. Next thing is burning items at bonfires. Basically, you sit down at a bonfire and there's an
Yes, this is another thing that I think is good, not standard. The closest thing you get to it is Dark Souls 3 has you burning the. I forget what they're called, but the things that increase your potency. Undead Bone Shards, I think they're called. The ones that increase the amount of potency of your flasks. And then you upgrade both the amount of flasks that you have and the potency of your flasks in Elden Ring. That's kind of the closest you get, but nothing anything like bonfire aesthetics. Though even though it's not standard, I do think that's a very good thing that was introduced in Dark Souls 2.
to burn an item. There is an item called Bonfire Ascetic. This is something that I think is like sorely missed in Elden Ring. So you burn a Bonfire Ascetic at a bonfire and it resets all of the area's items and all of the area's bosses, and then it elevates that area into the next new game cycle. I feel like people have been asking for the ability to repeat bosses in Elden Ring for so long, and this honestly would be the perfect solution to that. And this leads me to
Yeah, that would have been an incredible feature. I think it would have been great in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. It's something that I really hope they bring back as well.
the next one, which is New Game Plus enhancements. In all the other games, New Game Plus is harder, but it's just because they raise the numbers of everything. Like, everything does more damage and has more health. But in Dark Souls 2, you get new and different enemy spawns throughout areas, which totally changes the way it feels to play. There's also way more dramatic changes in New Game Plus.
So, how I operate in all of the non-Dark Souls 2 games is I'll create a new character, I'll go through the game, I'll beat the game, and once I beat the final boss, get the credits and whatnot, I just delete the character. Because I don't see any point in going to New Game Plus, but adding new enemies and bosses, well, not bosses, but an extra boss encounter, new enemies, stuff like that. Personally, not my thing. That's not something that I care about that much. But that is an objectively good thing, giving the players more content, giving the players a reason to go through the game a second time on a single character. So, personally, not something that I care about, but that is an objectively good thing, yes.
Like, for example, there's this one area where the final boss of that area shows up earlier in the level and then jump scares you. But this only happens on New Game Plus. It's not there in a fresh save. So I feel like Dark Souls 2 is way more dedicated to New Game Plus than any of the other games. And the rest of these are all great, but honestly, they might be a little bit too small to go over right now. And you could read through.
Yeah, so here, there's a list of things. He says he's not going to go over them. I will. So, here tells you where you missed bonfires. Not a big thing, small quality of life thing. That's good. Zero penalty covenant jumping. This one I really disagree with. Covenants, I wish had more penalties. I wish covenants really grabbed you and just made you pick one and stick to it. And you can kind of see that a tiny bit. You can see the glimpse of an idea in the Volcano Manor in Elden Ring, where part of joining the Volcano Manor is you need to kill fellow Tarnished. But it's not just some random Tarnished you've never heard of. It's Old Knight Istvan, who was able to help you in the coastal cave very early in the game. There's Greathorn Tragoth, who can help you with both Radahn and the Magma Worm that you have to beat in order to get into Altus Plateau. He also gives you a greeting gesture, so he's legitimately a good person and you have to kill him. And I think that's great. And I wish they did even more than that. I wish I wish that there were multiple covenants, and if you join one covenant, another covenant would get mad at you and treat you as an enemy, and then you would have to deal with invaders from that other covenant, maybe lock you out of an area or a boss or an NPC quest line. And the closest to that you get is Bloodborne, where if you, because it has oaths instead of covenants, but if you have on the Vile Blood oaths or the, I think it's called Executioner's Oath, if you have one of those two on and then someone else has the other one on and you try to do co-op, then it takes far longer, and then you end up, like, whoever's trying to join as a cooperator will end up being summoned as an adversary. And that's the closest you get, and I wish there was more of that. So, zero penalty covenant jumping, I highly disagree with. Next up, better critical animations. Yes. And this is something that really bothers me in the other games, because in Dark Souls 1 and I believe Dark Souls 3, if you get a critical hit with a scythe, you stab the scythe into the enemy as if it's a straight sword, and it looks so stupid, and it bothers me so much that I go out of my way to avoid getting criticals with scythes, despite loving scythes. But in Elden Ring, you will wrap the scythe around the enemy and pull the scythe through the enemy, like the blade part of it through the enemy. And it looks so good, and I love it so much. And so, better critical animations, very good. I like that a lot. Inventory, he says it looks a little better, allows you to consume souls without being booted. The first thing looks a little better. I think that's a personal thing. I think that's subjective. Second, allows to consume souls without being booted. What he means by that is when you can, like, when you go into the inventory and you use a poppable soul, it will kick you out of the inventory. It will boot you out of the inventory. I know that for Elden Ring, I don't know about the other games, but definitely for Elden Ring, you can press the lock-on button and it will get rid of the right side of your inventory, and then you can see your character there. And doing that and consuming souls will not boot you out of the inventory, so that's a good thing. I agree with that, but at the very least, Elden Ring has a solution to that. I don't know about the other games offhand. Next, environmental weapons with ballistas everywhere. That's another thing, kind of like the New Game Plus having more enemies, where I don't care about that. That's not something that I would ever use. But I can see it being a nice quality of life thing, make the world feel a bit more realistic. And then cinematic effects, Bridge to Dragon Shrine. That's whatever, I don't care about that. So that's just a wash in my eyes. Multi-effect stats. Upgrading endurance also yields a bit of health. And this definitely agree with. Leveling up endurance and getting a little bit of health, just that way, even if you're focusing on other stats, you're gaining a little bit of survivability. That is very nice. And then you can level up the health stat to gain a bigger boost of health. I do like that. And then quick climb up / down on ladders. In Dark Souls 1, you could quick climb down ladders. You couldn't quick climb up, though, so not gonna give him the down, but I'll give him the up. Next up, running while locked on. I agree with that. Small quality of life buff. And then 4 ring slots versus 2. This is another thing where I think it's a double-edged sword. Because, yeah, having 4 ring slots instead of 2 is good. But something I noticed while playing through Dark Souls 1 is that the rings are a lot more powerful. They do a lot more. Whereas in the later games, the rings feel a bit less powerful. They feel a bit less impactful. Part of this is like Havel's ring, where in Dark Souls 1, it's like 50%, whereas in Dark Souls 3, I think it's like 15%. So you get more ring slots, which is good, but the rings typically are a bit weaker. So there's that. And then there's also, and this is a subjective thing on my end, but I really like how the 2 ring slots made you think. Because you had to go, oh, well, I want Howl's ring, I want Chloranthy ring, I want this ring, I want that ring. But I only have 2 slots. And so it really forces you to pick and choose and to make these trade-offs. And I really like how that made you think. And the other games, like the later games, just don't have that as much. And then at the bottom, kind of hard to see it, but dynamic UI. Like I said, I don't have nearly as much experience in Dark Souls 2 as the other games. As I said, I have yet to beat it, so... And my one run was a while ago, so I don't remember what the UI looks like offhand. But I can... Like, I'm not going to disagree. I think it might be a personal thing, but I'm not going to disagree.
These real quick if you want, but I want to get to the bad because there's a very long list of game mechanics that are just plain bad. And I think it's the biggest reason why people think that this game overall is bad. This is where it gets really ugly, to be honest. So let's go over this. All right.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that the bad parts of a game are what make people think that it's bad. Incredible commentary.
Right, here we go. Adaptability. You probably heard of this if you looked into this game at all, but...
So adaptability... I'll let him explain it a little bit before I jump in.
But adaptability is a new stat that does a couple of different things, but the main reason you upgrade this stat is to get more iframes for your dodge rolls. So you start the game with a very tiny window that you are actually invulnerable in the middle of your dodge. And it's way too small. It completely destroys your confidence.
So here it says Dark Souls 1, 11 iframes, Dark Souls 2, 5, and then 11 after you level up ADP. And this is something where I'm going to mostly agree. I don't think the concept of ADP is inherently bad. I think what they got wrong was having 5 and 11. Because you start out with less iframes, and then you have to put in a bunch of levels to get to the same amount of iframes as the other games. Whereas I feel like they could have done 2 things. Either one, started out at 5 and ended at like, say 18. So you start out at a disadvantage, but you end with an advantage. I feel like that could have been one path for them to take in order to make ADP feel a bit smoothed over. And the second path is to just have 11 iframes right from the get-go, like the other games, and to not have ADP interact with iframes at all, but instead do other things like let you climb faster or regain stamina faster, like better stamina regen, or give you more resistance to status ailments like poison. I feel like if they had done one of those 2 things, ADP would have been a lot better received. But ADP as it currently is a problem, yes.
That you build up from playing Dark Souls 1. It requires you to constantly relearn the feel of dodging as you're upgrading it, and it's not till like the mid to late game where it starts to feel more like the other games and like you could actually dodge things. It also
And that's something that I actually didn't think about until he brought it up in the video, of needing to relearn dodging. So that's something that I did not think of, and he makes a good point. You have to relearn dodge timings as you go through the game.
sucks you dry in like a bad way, not a good way. Like
That's That's a strange thing. Let's hope that he doesn't bring that up again.
It requires so many souls to get this up to a decent level that you just feel like you're wasting souls. Like, why couldn't these iframes just be there from the start? Next one here is Vitality. They also had this in Dark Souls 3.
Alright, so Vitality, it says it's dumb to have a stat dedicated to equip load, just sucks you dry. That was in Dark Souls 3 too, and glad they ditched it in Elden Ring. This is something that I can kind of half agree with, because being forced to level up a stat purely for equip load, especially when you have ADP on top of that, that kind of sucks. However, I think of Vitality being its own stat kind of like intelligence or faith, where it's a stat for people who need it. Where if I'm doing a melee build, if I'm using like a great axe or a great sword or whatever, I don't need intelligence and I can just ignore it. Maybe I need, or maybe I want a little bit so that way I can use some kind of like sorcery buff to my weapon. Or same with faith. I'm not using miracles or incantations, but maybe I want just a little bit so I can have like a heal spell or some kind of buff, something like that. Then I can put a few levels into faith. But if I don't need it, I don't need it. I see Vitality as much of the same thing, where a lot of dex builds don't need a lot of equip load. A lot of magic builds don't need a lot of equip load. And so it's just a stat that depends on the build you're creating, much like intelligence and faith. And so that's how I see it, and I don't have a problem with it because of how I see it.
I don't know why they decided to continue with this. It's just dumb to have a stat completely dedicated to equip load. It just, again, sucks you dry. Here's one that's really stupid and dumb. Your health declines every time you die, and then it bottoms at 50%. And this is...
Alright, so I'm gonna let him explain this a little bit, but I have words for this one.
kind of like Demon Souls, but it's not as bad because in Demon Souls, the only way to get this back was to kill a boss. Whereas in Dark Souls 2, you can just use an item to get it back. But the reason why you don't want to do that is because the item you use is a human effigy, which is like the multiplayer item of this game. And there's so many other uses, and it's such a very limited item that it's just really not a good idea to be spamming these effigies every time your health starts declining. So you basically just deal with the health debuff. You can also use a ring that raises the floor to 75%, and you're just going to have this on all the time. So you basically have 3 ring slots instead.
I think this is a good time to jump back in. So there are 3 things. Overall, as a whole, I semi-agree with it. I semi-agree with it because if you die, then you probably have a hard time. Like, if you died, it's probably because you're struggling, and then cutting a bit of your maximum HP is just going to make you struggle even more. And so it can feel like punching you when you're down. And so I can agree with it from that perspective, but I disagree with it from... semi-disagree with it from the perspective of what I said before near the beginning, where I think this game wants to fill you with despair. It wants you to feel despair. And so you die, you lose your souls, and you have to go back and get them. And you lose a bit of your maximum HP, and there's a chance for you to get invaded by the Forlorn. And all of these things just stack up to beat you down more and more and more and more and more, further adding to that feeling of despair. And so I think it was done intentionally to further push that feeling. And then the third thing is the rings. Like I said, 4 rings, not necessarily a good thing, more of a double-edged sword, because sometimes, like, there's some rings that are just a lot better than the rest, and so you're just forced to have that ring on. Meaning you don't even get 4 ring slots, you effectively get 3, maybe even 2, and then a lot of the other rings are nerfed. So, not necessarily a good thing, more of a double-edged sword.
Before. Just kind of dumb. I also feel like this is completely contradictory to the entire like philosophy of all of the Soulsborne games. The games are challenging and they're hard, but the whole like vibe of the game is that yeah, there's a challenge, but you're gonna figure it out and you're gonna get through it. Whereas this game...
So, if you take a second to just think about Dark Souls, like, what is the premise of Dark Souls? You are a high functioning zombie tasked with killing God. I don't know about you, but if I was put in that position, I would not be a beacon of optimism. Like, I'd do my best, but I wouldn't be a real go getter in that situation because killing God is kind of a difficult task, as it turns out. So, trying to punch you when you're down, trying to instill this feeling of despair, I think that makes a lot of sense for the Souls games. And he says that it contradicts what the rest of the games are going for. But to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that it contradicts what the other games are going for. It just means that it's doing something different. It's standing out. It's being unique. The same way that Bloodborne did something very unique. Whereas Dark Souls 1 is very slow paced, it's very methodical. Bloodborne threw that out the window. It's way faster, it's way more aggressive, it's way more proactive. You drop the shield. It's a lot more go, 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 go. And you could say, oh, that's contradictory to Dark Souls 1, but it did something different. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it just depends on what the idea is and how well the idea is executed.
Tells you, hey, like, you're having a hard time figuring it out, so we're going to increase the challenge for you. Like, that just makes zero sense. Okay, so now we're getting to this.
Again, it makes zero sense until you start to think of Dark Souls 2 as trying to instill despair into you. Because it wants you to feel hopeless. It wants you to feel like there's no escape. If I remember correctly, part of the story is them trying to break the cycle or trying to remove themselves from the cycle. I believe that's what Aldia is trying to do. And it doesn't work out. Like, it doesn't end well. And so I think that it makes sense and that it fits with the game.
Stamina system, and there's a whole bunch of changes, and they all suck. So going into negative, this works the same as in all of the other games, except for you're penalized for doing it in this game, which makes no sense. If you don't know what going into negative stamina means, it's just when you perform an action that consumes more stamina than you have left in the bar. So like if you put this in terms of numbers, let's say you have 5 stamina units left in the bar, and then you perform an attack that costs 10. Well, now you're at -5.
Alright. One, I appreciate the visuals. I'm a very visual person, so appreciate this. But take a second to think about what he said. You're punished for going into the negatives. You use more than your entire stamina bar, and you're punished for that. That makes complete and total sense. If you use more resources than you have, you should be punished. That's kind of the entire point of debt. This is just stamina debt.
Now you have to recover that -5 to get to 0 before you can start recovering the bar that you actually see. In Dark Souls 2, you're penalized for doing this, and one of the things that happens is it reduces the damage and speed of your attack. I just think that this is really dumb because...
Once again, I appreciate the visual. I appreciate the putting two things right next to each other so you can directly compare them. But this makes sense. I think this is more realistic because think of being in a fight in real life. Or say you're going out for like a run. If you have a ton of stamina, you're going to be able to run pretty fast. Whereas once you've been running for a while and you're running very low on stamina, you're naturally going to slow down. You're not going to be able to push as hard. And so to me, it makes sense and it seems realistic for this to happen, for you to be out of stamina and for you to not be able to like throw a swing as hard. That just makes sense to me. It just seems more realistic.
There was already a trade-off for going into negative stamina in these games, and having this extra damage reduction is actually a double penalty because...
And it wasn't even that big of a damage reduction. Like, it was 778 and 708, I believe. So that's like a 10% decrease in damage. That's not that big.
Remember, you already had to wait for that negative stamina to recover. So that means that that attack already costed you more time than usual. So it was already balanced, and this risky style of play was something that you could choose to do if you wanted to. Whereas now in Dark Souls 2, you kind of just never do it because there's such a big downside, and it's just never worth it. So you're basically...
There's another change. I could be wrong about this, but I believe there's a longer delay in Dark Souls 2 compared to the other games on when you start recharging stamina. So once you swing, you lose stamina, but you don't instantly regain stamina. And the time after swinging to the point where you start recovering stamina, that period of time is longer in Dark Souls 2 than any of the other games in the series, to my knowledge. Again, I could be wrong about that, but I feel like that has more of a detrimental impact on the playstyles that you can feasibly go with more than a 10% reduction in damage.
Never going to be doing this. You're always going to be making sure that your stamina bar stays in the positive, which means you're never using the stamina to its full potential. It's kind of wasteful. Going into negative...
So he says never, but that just feels like a risk aversion playstyle to me. That seems like something that he does, but not everyone. Different people play differently. Some people might still be willing to take that trade-off, even if he's not.
Stamina also prevents you from running until the bar is fully regenerated. Now, I thought this was a problem unique to Dark Souls 2, but after looking into it, it turns out this actually happens in all of the games, even in Elden Ring. But I only ever noticed this while playing Dark Souls 2, which leads me into the next couple of points.
So, for that, if you've watched some of my runs, you may notice I have very stamina-hungry builds. At least my favorite builds are very stamina-hungry. And because of that, this is something I noticed in every single game. Like, all of them. I hit negative stamina in every game. Pretty consistently until, like, the end of the game where I have a ton of levels into endurance. But he says that this is something that happens in every game, but then adds it as a negative. And so, I don't entirely see why he would do that if it's something that every game has. And you could say, oh, well, a negative in every game is still a negative in this game, right? But in the beginning, he mentioned that people see Dark Souls 2 as being bad, whereas they don't see the other games as being bad. Which would at least imply that Dark Souls 2 has unique flaws that the other games don't. And so I don't see why he would be bringing up flaws that every single game has. But beyond that, I don't even think it's a flaw. And even more than that, it's not even a full stamina. Once you run out of stamina, you need your stamina bar to get to, I believe, 70%. So, like, here, before you can start running again.
Which is that there's simply not enough stamina in this game. Upgrading endurance doesn't give you much stamina, and certain things seem to cost way too much. So here we go, look at this. So that's how much stamina it costs to swing an Ultra Greatsword, the heaviest weapon type in the entire game. And now here's what it costs to just dodge. So you can see dodging is...
Yeah, this is something that I 200% agree with. He is more than correct on this. See, when an enemy swings, you have 4 options. You can either 1, shield the attack, 2, dodge the attack through rolling, 3, parry the attack, or 4, dodge the attack through movement. And all of these different methods, I mean, there's a 5th method of just stunning the enemy by swinging first, I suppose, but all of those methods have different levels of risk, different levels of reward, and different levels of stamina cost. And shielding has the highest stamina cost, partially because it's the lowest risk, because just comparing shielding and rolling for a minute here, if you want to roll, you have to roll at the correct time, you have to roll in the correct direction, and if you're caught in a roll, you take extra damage. Whereas if you shield, you don't need to worry about the timing, you don't need to worry about the direction, you don't need to worry about doing it at the wrong time and taking damage. So those 3 risks are all just out the window. All you need to do is hold up your shield and you're good. And so because of that, it should take more stamina. And because of those risks, dodging should take less stamina. So something that Dark Souls 2 did was discourage the player from using shields. That's part of why twin blades are a thing. That's part of why dual wielding is a thing. And if you look at a lot of the early shields in Dark Souls 2, pretty much none of them have 100% physical damage negation, whereas a lot of them in Dark Souls 1 and 3 and Elden Ring do. And that's to discourage the player from shielding. But if you discourage shielding, that's naturally going to encourage dodging. But if dodging has such high costs, then that discourages dodging. And then you can go, okay, well, how about movement? But Dark Souls 2, you can only move in 8 directions instead of the full 360 like every other game, including Dark Souls 1, which came out before. And so because of those limited movement options that feel clunkier, and because Dark Souls 2 has some funky hitboxes, those two things in combination discourage dodging through movement as well, which leaves nothing but parrying, which is a very high risk option, which also discourages that because it's so high risk, which just leads you back to dodging. And so dodging having such a high stamina cost mixed with the lower iframes is really bad. And like this, in my opinion, dodging should take like 50 to maybe like 30% of the stamina. I'd say more like 50. So yeah, this is absolutely a massive problem.
It's basically like swinging around an ultra great sword. And this is on New Game Plus after upgrading the shit out of endurance. So you're not going to be...
Yeah, see, Dark Souls 1, it takes like 40%, and I think that's good. I think that's how it should be. Whereas Dark Souls 2 just went yikes.
dodging much because it's going to cost half of your stamina bar. I just don't get why it's so much. It wasn't like this in Dark Souls 1. And it's not really pleasant to just like stand around in boss fights all the time just waiting for your stamina to recharge. I used the stamina regen ring and it still was like not like helping enough. It's not good. This next one...
Yeah, the Chloranthy ring, which improves stamina recovery speed, it doesn't lower the delay between swinging and starting to recover your stamina, which is another reason why Dark Souls 2 just feels so bad, because of that delay and because there's nothing to help that delay. If ADP helped with that delay, that'd be good. That could have fixed a lot of issues.
Conditional weapon damage. Absolutely infuriating. Okay? So the damage of your weapon is lowered for all kinds of reasons. One of the reasons, for example, if you decide to give the enemy your tip. So let's say you're using a really massive, long...
Again, just... no, don't like that.
sword. If you hit the enemy with the middle of the sword, all will be normal. But if you hit him with the tip of the...
Alright, so 778, 545, so... He takes more... Enemy takes more damage if you hit with the middle of the weapon. He says this as a bad thing. I disagree. I think this is a good thing. For two reasons. One, if the entire weapon does the same amount of damage, then why would you ever use the middle of the weapon? You should always use the maximum range of the weapon. Whereas when it's split like this, then you're forced to make the decision of, do I go with damage at the middle of the weapon, or do I go with range with the tip of the weapon? And it forces you to make that decision, and it gives you that option. And I think that's good. Second thing is that it's more realistic. Because if you hit with the tip of the Ultra Great Sword, there's not as much weight behind it. Whereas if you hit with the middle of the weapon, there is more weight behind it, and so more weight, more damage. Whereas I believe scythes are the opposite, where hitting with the end of the scythe does more damage because that's the blade part. Whereas if you hit with the handle of the scythe, the like part made of wood, then that's going to do less damage. That's more realistic. That makes sense. I think that's a good thing.
sword, it's going to do reduced damage. Okay, so basically you're penalized for making the most out of your weapon and taking advantage of its reach. You also have your damage drop if your weapon clips through the environment. And if you use, like I was using, an Ultra Greatsword or any other large greatsword, that's just constantly happening. Like, it's unavoidable most of the time you're playing these games.
This is another thing that I disagree with for the exact same reason. If your weapon hits rock, that's going to slow down the momentum of your weapon. If you slow the momentum of your weapon, you're going to do less damage. So I see this as a good thing because it makes things more realistic without being too much of a detriment. Like, his weapon didn't bounce off. His weapon didn't do no damage. It just did a bit less damage, and I see that as a bit realistic. Like, adding some realism, I see that as a good thing. Though, I can see why that would be annoying.
Also seems to happen when you clip through multiple enemies. So you think you're all bad, you're going to like swipe through 5 enemies at once, take them all out in one move, but no, that's not going to happen. Instead, your damage diminishes.
This is also more realistic because as you hit an enemy, that's going to slow down the momentum of your weapon. But I can very much understand this one because it's not like you're hitting a giant block of rock. You're hitting a person. And so dropping nearly 200 damage for hitting a person, that just discourages you from taking on multi-fights where you're already outnumbered. So, like, you have the disadvantage of being outnumbered, and you have the disadvantage of, if you end up hitting multiple enemies at once, well, you're doing less damage. So I can understand that.
With each enemy. There's also like undetermined sources of damage drops. Watch this clip right here. I'm using the same moveset of the Ultra Greatsword. It's a two-handed light attack. So I go attack this guy once, one-shots him. Now I walk right over here to another of the same enemy, and now it doesn't one-shot him. And I really don't know why. It almost seems like there's a random modifier on the damage of your weapon, where it's just like randomly goes up or down. Or it's like there's a random modifier on enemy health.
So I can understand this one, and I'm going to give both sides to this. I can see why he doesn't like it, because it takes away consistency. Because if you take, say, 2 swings to kill an enemy, and you take 2 swings, kill the enemy, 2 swings, kill the enemy, 2 swings, kill the enemy, pretty soon you're going to stop taking a 3rd swing just to save stamina. But if you swing twice on the same enemy, or same enemy type, but they survive with just a tiny sliver of HP, then that can lead to you taking unnecessary damage. And that's just not fun. That's not good. Like, that just, it doesn't add enjoyment. It takes away from it. And it can also make things more difficult if you're trying to figure out how many levels you should put into your main damage stat. It can help with, like, speedrunners. It can help with no-hit run people. Like, having consistency can help those groups. And so having variation, I can see why that's a problem. But on the other side of things, if this were real life and you were swinging, not all these enemies would be in the same health conditions. Not all these enemies would have the same amount of like muscle mass. Not all these enemies would have the same exact carbon copy armor or have their armor be in the same quality. Maybe you'd swing in a slightly different position or hit at a different angle, and so this makes things more realistic. And so I can understand that aspect of it, and I can appreciate that aspect of it. But I'm leaning more towards Joe's side of thing, like Joe's opinion on this, of kind of sucks that the enemy health bars aren't consistent. Although, he types enemy with 3 E's, so can we really agree with him too much?
Like, it's unexplainable. I really don't know what's going on, and it's very annoying. Also, I don't know if anybody else plays like this, but when I play these games, I kind of really rely on the knowledge.
And actually, this is something that I noticed in Elden Ring. Going through Mogwin's palace, some of the enemies, the Elven orcs, some of them I two-shot, some of them I swing twice and they survive with just a sliver of HP. And so I can feel this firsthand, and it is annoying.
Of how many hits it takes to kill certain enemies. So if a particular enemy takes only 1 hit to kill, I'll save that knowledge for later, and then in a moment where I'm like trapped in a corner and there's that specific enemy in front of me, I know I could kill it in 1 hit and then move on. But in this game, that doesn't happen because there's random debuffs that lower your damage, and now the enemy will suddenly take 2 hits. And so you kind of like don't ever know what's going to happen when you're attacking an enemy. Now I want you to think about some of these game mechanics and ask yourself, what are the devs trying to tell you?
All right, 3 things. 1, just keep swinging. Like, if you're trapped in a corner, just swing until you know they're dead. 2, he showed the UI there. We can play it again.
Happen because there's random debuffs that lower your damage, and now the enemy will suddenly take 2 hits. And so you kind of like don't ever know what's going to happen when you're attacking an enemy. Now I want...
Yeah, he showed the UI there, and it did look good. It looked smooth. Especially with how the camera moves positions. So when he said good is the UI, I can see that in the gameplay here, and I agree with that.
you to think about some of these game mechanics and ask yourself, what are the devs trying to tell you? Do they not...
They're trying to add realism, they're trying to add a feeling of despair, and I think they did a pretty good job of that.
want you to clip weapons through the wall? Do they not want you to attack enemies using the full reach of the weapon? These things are unavoidable unless you just decide you're never going to use a large weapon.
They don't want you to clip your weapon through the wall every single time. Like I said, it adds realism, and the damage debuff isn't too bad. And for the, oh, do they not want you to use the full range of your weapon? Like I said, that becomes a trade-off. Do you want to go with the middle of your weapon for damage or the tip of your weapon for range? That is a trade-off, a choice that you have to make, and it feels realistic.
And if that's what they're trying to tell you, then what's the point of even having Ultra Greatswords? Like, these mechanics clearly don't add anything to the game, and they just take away from the experience. All right, these next two are kind of...
And that sentence right there, of they don't add anything to the game, that's the big crux of what made me decide to make this video. Just responding to him. Because I don't think he understands that idea of adding realism and adding the feeling of despair intentionally. So maybe he sees this, I don't know, kind of doubt it, but going through this, hopefully this will give you a new perspective on Dark Souls 2.
connected. Lock-on in this game is a soft lock. So what that means is you can still attack in multiple different directions, even if you're locked on, which constantly messes with your ability to strafe or backpedal while attacking, because the attack will be in whatever direction you're currently moving instead of at the enemy. The only way to deal with this is either to let go of the left stick, and who wants to do that every single time they're attacking, or you hold your stick in the direction of the locked-on enemy. And I think this is pretty obviously nonsense, because if I wanted to attack in different directions, then I wouldn't be using the lock-on feature. That's the whole...
Yeah, so I actually had this problem in Dark Souls 3. when I tried to use an Ultra Great Sword once, and I got to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley before it bugged me so much that I went into the settings to see if I could fix it. And there was actually a setting for it, and I turned the setting off, and I went the rest of the run with no issues. So, there is a solution to that. Does Dark Souls 2 have that solution? I don't know. And I'm not going to open up Dark Souls 2 just to see if a single setting exists. So, I can't... Like, I agree with the sentiment, and I mostly agree with it in general, but Dark Souls 3 has a solution to that. Maybe Dark Souls 2 does as well. So, whether I fully agree or just half agree depends on if that setting exists. If it doesn't, then I fully agree that's stupid. They should have added the setting or just gotten rid of that mechanic. If that setting does exist, then I half agree because I still think it's stupid. I understand why they did it, so that way you can lock onto one enemy and attack another, but in that case, just don't lock on. Simple. But if it does have that setting, then you can just do that setting and it'll fix it for you. Like I said, Dark Souls 3 has it. I know
Point
that
of
much.
locking on. Next one is the movement system is locked onto 8 cardinal directions from your character. So think of like a compass rose on a map. You could only move along these directions. Now watch these clips. You could clearly see in Dark Souls 2, the guy is like snapping to different points as he's walking in a circle. But in Dark Souls 1, it's very fluid and like basically has infinite amount of directions that you can move.
Alright, so 2 things. One, I appreciate the visual of the compass, and I appreciate the visual of this side to side to give you a direct comparison. And 2, this is something I brought up before when talking about the dodging and how it takes too much stamina. Because the clunky movement system, where you only get to move in 8 directions, that really discourages you from using movement in order to dodge attacks, which just makes the game feel worse. And the fact that you can only move in 8 directions in this game, whereas you can move in a full 360 in the game that came out before it, feels so strange. It makes Dark Souls 2 feel like it was an indie game made by someone making their first video game in like 2 days. I probably shouldn't say that because there have been some incredible indie games in the past few years, but still, it feels highly unpolished. And this is something they probably could have fixed in a single patch. It's something that they really should have fixed when going from vanilla to Scholar of the First Sin. But yeah, massive issue. And it is, more than anything, by quite a long shot, honestly, my biggest problem with Dark Souls 2, and the biggest reason I did not finish Dark Souls 2 was because that 8 direction movement system bothered me to no end, and I could not get past it.
Moving. And the fact that this exists makes the soft lock even worse of an issue. Because remember, now you're aiming at enemies while locked on. So guess what happens when an enemy falls in between 2 of the 8 directions in which you can move? You just miss. You're just constantly missing attacks. And I know this is not a skill issue because this doesn't happen on any of the other Souls games. Moving on. Enemies will follow you literally till the end of time. And this is connected to the next 2 bullet points that I have.
So this has a very easy solution. Kill the enemy. That's it. Legit, just kill the enemy. It is that simple. But also it adds to the realism. So, we're looping it back to the realism thing.
Enemies have an insane aggro range, way longer than any of the other games. That's all fine and dandy, but the problem is that this aggro range is only an initial thing. So you walk into the range, you aggro the enemy. But if you step out of that range any point after that, it doesn't matter. They no longer have an aggro range, and they will follow you forever. The only time that they do stop following you is once you meet invisible thresholds that were specifically set by the devs. And now this ties into the next part, which is that animations are only partially covered with iframes. So,
only partially covered, once again, this would not be a problem if you just killed the enemies. Two, let's loop it back again. It makes things more realistic. Because why would you be invincible to like an axe when you're opening a door? Why would you be invincible to a halberd or a katana when you're trying to move through some fog? I appreciate, or I understand why people would want that, because it is a quality of life thing, but it does make things less realistic. And that's something that I personally would prefer the realism over the quality of life.
This is a scenario that happens all the time. You run past a bunch of enemies to retry a boss. You aggro the entire area because they all could see you from miles away. All 30 of these enemies follow you despite your increasing distance. And then once you get to the fog gate and try to cross through it, you get ganked and insta-killed because you're not...
A lot of people, they'll talk about this and they'll show the Iron Keep and all the Elan Knights. And again, very, very simple solution, just kill the enemies. It is as simple as that.
Protected during this animation. You're just stuck, but completely vulnerable. The same thing goes for other things like chests, doors, and levers. Chests will take like 3 times as long to open in this game as all of the other games, and you could just get hit during it. And now for doors, what I'm talking about here...
I mean, you probably shouldn't be opening a chest when there's an enemy right there. You should probably kill the enemy and then open the chest. Not that difficult. Like, personally, when I walk into a room and there's 2 enemies and an item, I kill the 2 enemies and then I pick up the item. Because that item is still going to be there after the enemies are dead. That chest is still going to be there after you kill the enemies. So you should kill them first. You should put in the work first and then get the reward after. This just seems like a greed thing on his part, I think.
Is not doors that have like a key to open or like doors that unlock a shortcut. What I'm talking about are just plain old regular doors that are everywhere, and they're there just to slow you down. They're literally like speed bumps on the road. The door opening animation is slow, and again, you could get hit during it. And then to top it off, all of these doors will close again once you reset the...
He said, like, there was a text pop-up saying that it's a super slow animation. That was like 2 seconds.
area. So you have to open them every time you go through these areas. So from the last bunch of things that I just talked about, my understanding...
So, 1, the animation isn't that slow. 2, not that big of a deal. 3, more realism. Because the enemies are there, they're going to close the door. Like, they're just going to close the door. That's realistic and simple. But it also encourages you to play slower and more methodically to take out all the enemies. And I think, for the most part, that's a good thing.
is that they don't want you to run past enemies, which I kind of understand, but there's already an incentive to not run past enemies the first couple times you are going through an area, because if you do that, you're going to miss all of the souls. You're not going to be able to level up, and every boss you fight is just going to insta-kill you. But when you're on your 10th try in a boss, you don't want to kill the entire area every time. It's like the area before the boss is actually part of the boss. Moving on.
So, he admitted it. The game doesn't want you to run through the areas. The game doesn't want you to skip the content. And so, he's admitting that he just doesn't want to play the way the game plays. And that'd be like using a shield in Bloodborne and going, yeah, but I just don't like the guns. I want to use a shield. And I mean, you have that option, but it's not ideal. If you're struggling, you should play the way the game wants you to play, because that's the way that the game encourages you to play. That's how you're going to have the easiest time. And he said there the 10th time. Once you kill an enemy 15 times, they stop spawning. So if you've gone through 10 times, then you only need to do it 5 more times. That'll get you more souls, and it'll make it where the enemies don't spawn anymore. Meaning that infinite aggro range, not a problem. The no iframes while going through a fog wall, no problem. Like, just playing the way the game wants you to play solves so many of his issues. Like, not all of them, but a lot of them.
Illusory walls in this game are completely hidden, and there's way too many of them. When I mean completely hidden, there's no like clever little trick. These things are hidden in just flat, blank walls, and they're all over the place. So you always feel like you're missing something. And what makes this even more insane is that you don't roll into them or attack them to open them. You just press X. So you're telling me I gotta walk around the entire game just spamming X on every single wall, no matter if it looks like there's an illusory wall there or not? And also, some of these hide really big, crucial bonfires, like a bonfire that would save you a huge amount of time. So the illusory
A bonfire that saves you a huge amount of time being hidden behind an illusory wall. Like the one with the fair lady in Dark Souls 1. Seems like this might be an issue that occurred in another game as well. But I do, like that aside, I do agree with him on this. Where they changed the way that you interact with illusory walls, and it's something that was only ever done in Dark Souls 2. It wasn't done before, it wasn't done after. And the game doesn't explain that to you. And they can hide some pretty important stuff. And so that is a problem in my eyes. That is an issue.
wall system in this game is just not good at all, and that feeling of like finding a special cool secret is just completely gone with them. This next thing kind of happens a lot in these games, but it happens way more in this game.
And I didn't mention it before, but yeah, in the other games, there tends to be like an outline or some small way of telling, or maybe you can see an area from a different angle, and you go, well, how do I get there? And then you look around, there's no path, and so you start rolling into walls, and then boom, illusory wall. So there's usually some kind of hint or some way to tell, or some indication, whereas Dark Souls 2 doesn't have that. And so that is also an issue, yes.
And it's that hitboxes are constantly scummed. You always get hit by stuff that doesn't seem like it should connect, and it's happening way more often. And here's just a quick example. So we got this red phantom here, and watch how he hits me even though he didn't even swing. And we're gonna watch this frame by frame. Let's go. So he starts his swing, and now I already am in the middle of my swing. I hit him. And this is how far his swing actually gets. Nowhere near my body. Yet, a moment later, you see my health bar take some damage. Like, what? And here's another one. You're telling me this hit? I'm completely clear. All right, moving on to the
Yeah, that is a problem. Where the hitboxes, and especially the hitboxes plus the wonky movement of only being able to move in 8 directions, those two combined with rolling taking so much stamina, and stamina regen having delay, and having lower iframes than in the other games, those 5 things all combined to just make a terrible combat experience. So, yes.
Estus Flask. Healing in this game takes way too long.
It takes way too long. Well, that's why you have the life gems, right? I don't have any numbers in front of me, but if I remember correctly, you can move while popping life gems, and they, like, you pop them faster than the Estus Flask, if I remember correctly.
This game is generally faster paced than Dark Souls 1, yet healing takes like 3 times as long because you have to wait for it to happen. It isn't an instant heal. It isn't even like a fast heal. It's like this slow regeneration. It's like
That's another thing where it adds to the realism. And this might be a hot take, I don't know, but I love that. I love the slower heal, because it's like the Estus going through, making its way through your body, just regenerating you. Instead of just a, like, boom, basically instant heal, it makes you think about when and where to heal. And it makes combat more difficult. It makes bosses, especially some of the more difficult bosses, a lot more difficult. But I appreciate it. I really like that. So, I understand where he's coming from. I can see the point. And I'm not upset that the other games have a near instant heal, but that is a change that Dark Souls 2 did, where I see why they did it and I appreciate why they did it.
A regen spell. And honestly, I don't even think I'm going to talk about the rest of these, but just know that enemies don't
He said he's not going to talk about the rest of these, so I will. Weapon durability. Drains ultra fast, but it's repaired automatically while resting at bonfires. Yeah, this is a problem in my eyes. Though it's more of like a double-edged sword or a neutral decision that's just like a change for the sake of change. And then penalizes you for playing well. If you're playing well and you don't need to rest at bonfires, just activate them, you'll quickly have to stop and spend money on repairing your weapon. So, I soft disagree with that point, but I understand where he's coming from, and I do prefer how Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne did it, where the weapon durability degradation is a lot slower, but something that you have to manually go and repair and spend souls to repair. That's something that I like and prefer. But the reason why it drains so fast in Dark Souls 2 is, again, to add to that feeling of despair. And so that's just another reason, or that's the reason for another mechanic that he has an issue with. And then enemies respawn a limited amount of time, anti-farming. Like, he says that the enemies have infinite aggro range and how he doesn't like that, but then here's the solution, and then he doesn't like that, and then he says, can join the Covenant to stop this from happening, but that's dumb. I disagree with that. I really like how the enemies have a limited amount of lives, because I see it less as an anti-farming thing and more of, one, realism, as we keep coming back to, and two, the game going, okay, you've gone through this area 15 times. It's pretty clear that you're struggling, so we're gonna move the enemies out of the way so that way you can have a smoother time. So I can see it being anti-farming, but like, he has two problems here. One of, like, his first problem is that the enemies will follow you to the ends of the earth, but you can just kill them, and that solves that. You can kill him 15 times, and that perma solves that. But he doesn't like that. And then there's a covenant, like he says, anti-farming, but there's a covenant to stop that, and he doesn't like that either. And so it's like, he has one problem, and the game hands him a solution, but he goes, no, I don't like that. And the game hands him a different, like, the game hands him a solution to the solution, and he goes, no, I don't like that either. And so this, it seems like he's being difficult just for the sake of being difficult. And so I disagree on that one. Here, limited infusions. So I'm not someone who really gets into infusions. I usually throw like a blessed gem onto a longsword in Dark Souls 3 for the HP regen. And then I sometimes, occasionally, not sometimes, occasionally, but I do a few infusions in Elden Ring. Typically, like, heavy, keen, quality, or blood, or freezing. Those are the main 5 that I do. So, limited infusions doesn't affect me, but it limits player choice, so I can see that being a problem. And then camera control is awkward. He never brings this up. He never expands on this, and I don't entirely know what he means. Because in my playthrough, the camera felt just like all the other games. And so I would have liked for him to expand on the camera control is awkward point.
Spawn infinitely, and you can't farm them unless you join a specific covenant. Like, that's a thing. All right, that was quite a lot, and a lot of those things might be kind of nitpicky. I just wanted to provide like a detailed look at why people think that this game is bad, and this is a huge reason why. Like, all of these details working together just create this general feel of like being dragged down. I literally went back to Dark Souls 1.
Yeah, that general feel of being dragged down is intentional, though. It was done for partially the realism, mostly for that feeling of despair. And I'm not a big fan of how they executed that feeling of despair, but I understand why they did it. They did something different, and I can appreciate that. But I think that he sees all of these things as just being bad and having no reason to them, when there is a reason to them. It's for that feeling of despair and that realism. And I feel like the game does that fairly well, even if I disagree with some of the execution on it.
And played like an hour or two of it just to like see if all of the things that I'm pointing out as being negative actually made sense. And what I can say is, yes, these changes are definitely bad. Somehow Dark Souls 1 feels less clunky. And so that concludes this section.
That is something I completely agree with. Dark Souls 2 feels clunkier than Dark Souls 1, but I think the majority of it, the majority of that clunky feeling, goes back to those 5 things that I mentioned of you can only move in 8 directions, the funky hitboxes, rolling takes a lot of stamina, there's a delay between using stamina and being able to gain it back. Yeah, that small list of things. I think that's why Dark Souls 2 feels clunkier.
Of all these detailed like new game mechanics. You got all the good, you got all the bad, and now we're moving on to level design. And we're going to be starting with large scale. And I don't actually have anything good to say in this section, so we're going to go straight to the bad. So when I say large,
So he pulled that up again of like the good, the bad. Again, I disagree with that because there are some things that are a bit more complicated. There are some things where it's a double-edged sword. There are some things where it's up to, or it's more subjective. It's more up to personal opinion or personal playstyle or preferences. There's some things where it's not good or bad. It's just a neutral change. And so I think just saying good and bad is a bit oversimplified.
scale level design, I'm talking about the general path from the start of the game to the end of the game and what you have to do to get there. So in order to explain this, I literally drew a map. Like, this is a very oversimplified map of the world. And I'm going to quickly run you through the path that you take from start to finish because I think it's extremely chaotic. And while I'm going through this, I want you to think about Dark Souls 1 and how that game is always praised for having such a good level design with very intricate connection points between areas and just the general flow. And then compare that to what I'm about to go through. The way that this map is laid out.
Right back at the beginning, he said that being able to teleport from the very beginning of the game is a good thing. And we're bringing that back. Remember, in Dark Souls 1, you start off at Firelink Shrine right after getting out of the tutorial. And Firelink Shrine by itself connected to like 9 or 10 areas. And that's because there was no teleporting. And so the game devs were forced to think about that from the very beginning and build the world ground up with interconnectivity in mind. But since this game does have teleporting, they didn't have to think about that. Which is why this is just straight line, 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 straight line. All of them leading to dead ends. If you look at Dark Souls 1 after you get the Lord Vessel and the ability to teleport, where do you go? You go to the Duke's Archives. Straight line, dead end. You go through the catacombs and through the Tomb of the Giants. Straight line, dead end. You go through New Londo Ruins. Straight line, dead end. You go down to Blight Town into Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith. Straight line, dead end. Once you get the ability to teleport, world design kind of crumbles. Here, you can teleport from the very beginning. World design kind of crumbles right from the very beginning. So, like I said, that's not a good thing. It's a double-edged sword. It's got some good, it's got some bad. Whereas he breaks this up into the good and the bad. But he doesn't really do that. He takes the double-edged sword, ignores the bad part of it, and just claims that it's a good thing. But then later in the video comes back and says that the bad thing, or the bad part of that double-edged sword is bad, but doesn't link it back to what actually caused this in the first place. With that being said, Insanely Dangerous Hole. I think that's kind of funny. With that, I'm actually going to skip this part because... Oh, is this... Yeah, this is a world design. So we can skip that because I've said everything about that.
Cool idea. And that's it. That's all I got to say about the good. And now we're on to the bad. So now I'm going to talk about the design philosophy for many of the areas in the game. It's almost like their template for every area is like an Indiana Jones booby trap dungeon. Like think of Sen's Fortress from Dark Souls 1, and imagine if they tried to replicate that over and over again with like a different style every time. That's what a lot of these areas are. So you're constantly being like ambushed and like tricked every time you take a step. And I know all the other games...
Yeah, the other games have this, but Dark Souls 2 goes above and beyond, not in a good way. It really doubled down on traps, and this was done to further push that feeling of despair, because it's like every corner you're being beat down, every single corner there's enemies stabbing you in the back, every single corner. It's just constant paranoia, and that feels that feeling of despair. And that's part of why I said that I understand and appreciate the game doing that, but I disagree with some of the ways they did it. This is one of the bigger aspects that I disagree with from the game's perspective of I think they should have added more variety because one, it would have made the game more fun. Two, you can have feelings of despair without having constant traps. Like, Dark Souls 1 had areas with feelings of despair without having constant traps. Bloodborne had feelings of despair without constant traps. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Like, all the games had areas with feelings of despair without traps. And so I feel like Dark Souls 2 definitely could and should have done a lot better.
Have their fair share of being ambushed, but this is like a new level. It's just all that happens the whole time you play. Now this game does have really good areas, like the Forest of Fallen Giants I think is a really solid area and it's fun to play, but then you go from something like that to...
This has nothing to do with the video, but he mentioned the Forest of Fallen Giants, and something that I've noticed is in pretty much all the Souls games, the first area is always really good for some reason. Not as much in Dark Souls 1, but Undead Burg and Undead Parish, they're very tight, they're very interconnected, they feel good to go through. In Dark Souls 2, he said Forest of the Fallen Giants. In Bloodborne, you have Central Yharnam, an incredible area. In Dark Souls 3, you have High Wall of Lothric, not as good as Central Yharnam, not nearly as good, but still pretty decent. In Elden Ring, you have Stormville Castle, so I don't know what it is, but FromSoft really knows how to make their first levels.
The Shrine of Amana. This area is the single most awful area I've ever played in any Souls game, including the Poison World in Demon Souls. It's dark as hell and covered in water. This makes you really slow, you dodge slow, you can't see the floor through the water, but...
Right, so, again, I'm playing this on 1.5 times speed, but there was a message pop up about the water and the cliff.
There's holes everywhere where
Don't
you
see
can
it?
fall and
Neither
die.
do I.
Look at this, you can't see anything.
There it is. So, he was like, oh, you can't see where the land stops and where the death cliff starts. But he said that not even being close to it of course you wouldn't be able to see it if you're not close to it. But once you do get close to it, this is pretty clear, and Dark Souls 1, there's an area with a Hydra that you have to fight in Darkroot Basin, and it's not nearly this clear. And so, I think this is just complaining for the sake of complaining. And he walked a decent bit from the start of the water to here. So, the game gives you plenty of room for safety. Now, in the middle of a fight, probably won't be seeing this, but again, plenty of room.
There's enemies hidden beneath the water level that you can't see.
You can't see, but you can see that. That's an indicator of where they are. So, there's that. There's also, you can just move slowly. There are these pillars to take cover to deal with the magic firing enemies. You have options, you just need a bit of patience.
And they're everywhere. You're just constantly getting jumped by these guys. And then there's these magic spammers, which might be the most annoying enemy in all of Souls. The reason why these guys are so annoying is because they have an insane aggro range, which we talked about before, but they shoot this homing missile at you, which does way too much damage. It's like if I was somehow able to snipe you from the other side of the map, but then I'm dealing like great axe damage. Like that's what's going on here.
He says massive damage, and that is a decent chunk of damage. But it's not too unreasonable. Like, there are enemies in Elden Ring that do way more than that. Enemies that they have a lot more mobility, that are a lot faster, that have a lot more health. So, I don't, like, this is a good chunk of damage, but it's not the worst. And those projectiles were slow, and so they'd be easy to dodge. Like, yeah, they home, but the homing isn't that strong. It's not gonna turn around and do a 180 and hit you in the back after you dodge past it. So, but he said that there are enemies everywhere. That's a thing of Dark Souls 2 in general, not just this area. But yeah, that is a problem. The damage, not so much. You can put on a ring or better armor, or just dodge or shield. You've got options. There's also these giant pillars that will block them for you for free, easily. So, you've got options.
And these little wizards are all over the place. At any given point in time in this area, you got 2 or 3 of these homing missiles coming at you while you're trying to attack 2 guys that you didn't see under the water. Also, while not being able to run at full speed. Now, factor...
Again, you can hide behind the pillars. You can move it slower as to not have multiple melee enemies on you. You can pull out a bow. That's something that I occasionally do for Elden Ring, where I'll just have a bow that I have upgraded with whatever spare upgrade materials I have, and that can help out a lot. So, just play the game the way the game wants you to play it, or just have a bit of patience, or just have a bit of situational awareness, and you'll be fine.
In all of the dumb mechanics that I was talking about in the first part of this video, this area is a nightmare. And then you also got areas like the Black Gulch, which is just a...
Yeah, this is bad. Black Gulch is bad. I'm not gonna defend this.
lane of hundreds of poison spitters. There's also enemies popping out of the ground, out of the walls, and then an invader shows up and you're supposed to fight him amidst a poison dart field. And the only bonfire in the area that makes this easier is only accessible if you have one of those key items that we were talking about earlier. And like I said with the Forest of Fallen Giants, there are areas that are really good, but there's always just something about them that has to come in and ruin it. For example, Earthen Peak is actually really fun. It's a really cool area, but the way the last boss is handled just sucks. So you have this bonfire that's right up...
That joke got old after the first time, and he's pulled out like 5 times.
Above the boss room. And by the way, it's behind an invisible wall that you just have to click X on to open up. So you drop down, and then there's these 2 guys guarding the hallway to the fog gate. You could run past them, but there's a very good chance that while you're trying to cross through the fog gate, you're gonna get smacked. So you're gonna...
Kill them? Simple as that. Just kill them. Like, if there's an enemy in your way, just kill them. It is a very simple solution.
Start the boss with already half health. Then once you get into the room, the entire room is covered in poison, which not only poisons you, but heals the boss. But you can make this easier by removing the poison. And do you want to know how ridiculous this is? So this is how you remove the poison. You go back to a previous bonfire in the area, and then you go off the beaten path to this little cliff edge where there's this windmill. And now what do? You light the windmill on fire. Like, what?
Yeah, this is stupid. Everyone in the history of existence has talked about this and how lighting a metal part of a windmill on fire is... It's stupid. The what is justified. That is stupid. And also, how stopping a windmill from turning gets rid of poison also makes no sense. Very stupid. I appreciate being able to do something outside of the boss arena to make the boss easier, but that one is stupid. Lost... Is it the Lost Bastille? The one with the Sinner boss, where the room is dark and you light the two torches. That one's a lot better. They did that way better.
Windmills are not a thing in this reality that you light on fire. There's no reason why I should ever think, hey, I'm gonna go light this windmill on fire. Why? I don't get it. So that clears the poison out of the boss room. It doesn't actually clear all the poison. It only clears some of it. And that makes the boss...
I just want to point out, this right here, looking at our mouse, this right here is the line of poison that remains. This right here, and there's even more off screen, is what was gotten rid of. So he says only gets rid of some of the poison. My brother in Christ, that is like 90%. Imagine a politician with a 90% approval rating and then someone going, only some people like them. Like, no. I mean, one, that's probably dictatorship and that's probably rigged, but outside of that, this is not some. This is the vast majority of poison being thrown out. You're good. This is a tiny little thing. There's barely any poison left. It's not a problem. I don't see why he's saying some. This feels like more complaining just for the sake of complaining. But moving on.
Fight actually feasible. And there's something even more ridiculous in this exact area. After this boss fight, you go to an empty room where there's an elevator. The elevator goes up. And by the way, this is an image of the area. So as you're riding this elevator up, you're just thinking, hey, I'm going to like the next section of this tower. Like I'm going up to the top level now. Do you want to know what happens? The elevator takes you up out of the tower and into a land of volcanoes and lava. So you're telling...
Yeah, this is stupid. The easiest way to solve this would be to have the elevator go down. A better, though far more difficult way to fix this would be to build the world better. And the world probably would have been built better if there was no teleporting from the very beginning of the game. Like, I'm telling you, having teleporting as an option right from the very beginning is very nice for convenience. It is not very nice for building an interconnected, cohesive world. Like, people talk about how Dark Souls 2's map is a mess. You can teleport right from the very beginning. People talk about how Dark Souls 3 is very linear. You can teleport right from the very beginning. I'm telling you, teleporting right from the very beginning might sound like a good idea, but it has ramifications. It has a second side to that sword, and you do not want the second side of that sword.
Me that this lava pool is floating above the tower. Why wasn't it visible from the ground? Like these areas are just completely disconnected and it's very random. Another way that areas are spoiled is by complete like nonsensical interior designs. Let's look at Drenglich Castle. You walk into this grand front entrance hall with a double staircase leading upwards. This staircase leads to a throne room and nothing else. And the main...
Maybe I'm the weird one here, but that makes a bit of sense to me. Not the most amount of sense, but a bit of sense. Like, from the perspective of the monarch, like the king and the queen, wouldn't you want that? Wouldn't you want access to your throne to be pretty easy? Like, you don't want to do a bunch of walking to make it to your throne. you want things to be relatively easy. Because you're the monarch. Why would you want to put in a bunch of work walking to get to your throne? That's just silly.
Path is actually going around the stairs, through the back, dropping down into the basement, and then finding a bonfire there. Then you go to this room where there's like 10 different secret doors. Well, guess what? One of these secret doors is the main path. I'm assuming all of these are side content. So you go through this main path, and you're just walking through a bunch of like random rooms with nothing in them. Like, you don't even know what room of the castle you're in. And this continues for room after room after room. They all look exactly the same. Oh, this one's got a lady in the background that you could talk to, but it's also empty. And then there's a boss around the corner from this last room. Now, all of that I just...
Yeah, again, to me, that pushes that feeling of despair, where you're looking around, you're going, I'm so lost. There could be danger around any corner. I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know anything. What's going on? Like, that pushes that feeling of despair and this feeling of confusion. And I think it does a pretty good job of that.
Described, you can walk through in like 2 minutes. So it's not a long path. But the point I'm trying to make is that for such a grand and epic castle, there's like nothing here. They make you run through a path that just feels like a random assortment of video game assets. It feels like you're looking at one of those liminal space images where you could tell what you're looking at, but also you have no idea what you're looking at the same time. It's like we're...
I can kind of agree with that, where some things in Dark Souls 2 are just kind of thrown together, and it's pretty clear that this is like a video game and not like something that could actually exist in an alternate reality where a guy used a lightning bolt to kill a dragon. So I do agree with the sentiment, but I also understand where the game is coming from.
running around in the back rooms over here. Now, I know all of the Souls games have this feeling to at least some extent, but at least in like Dark Souls 1, you could tell what part of the castle you're in. Like right here, I could tell I'm in a bedroom right now.
Take out the bed and you wouldn't be able to tell it's a bedroom. I mean, who puts their bed there anyways? And it was kind of the same way with Dark Souls 2. In Drangleic Castle, there's a throne room. There's an armory room. Like, the room with what's-her-face. That's probably a room for people to go see the king and queen, to talk to them and help settle disputes and whatnot. So, you just need to stop and think for a minute.
It's not just a room with brick walls. All right, we're reaching the end of the video here, and the last thing I want to talk about is the torch mechanic and the levels that they designed based around it. They introduced this torch mechanic to you like right away, like it's a big part of the tutorial. So you're thinking, oh, okay, this is gonna be a big part of this game. No, there's only 2 areas of the game that were actually designed around the torch mechanic. And when I say designed around the torch, what I mean is that...
So what? Like, they added a mechanic, but they only put 2 areas dedicated to that mechanic. Again, so what? Elden Ring added a horse, but you have Limgrave, you have Liurny of the Lakes, you have Caelid, you have Altus Plateau, you have Mountaintops of the Giants, and then you have the 3 underground areas. So, Elden Ring way bigger than all the other games. It has... I don't remember how many bosses Dark Souls 2 has, but I think it's like 40 something. Whereas Elden Ring has like 165. So, massive game, but this new mechanic of the horse, oh, well, it's only used in 8 areas. Like, so? You can have a new mechanic and not have it be the central theme of every single area. Like, Dark Souls 1 had transient curses, but that's only the central focus in New Londo Ruins. Who cares? It's fine. It's really not that big of a deal. Just because there's new mechanic doesn't mean you have to have that mechanic be the central focus of every area. Like, Bloodborne added guns. You don't see guns be the central focus of every area. Or any area really, besides that one point going up to the Hemwick Charnel Lane. But the second thing to that is just because it's not the central focus in an area doesn't mean it's not useful in another area. Like, you can use the torch in other areas. It's useful in other areas. There are other areas where it's dark, and you can use the torch to light those areas up. And it's fine. It's good. It's useful.
It's part of the level to go through and light all of these standing torches so that you can see and figure out how to get through it. Now, like many of the other areas in this game, these two areas are both designed so that you can get jumped, mugged, ambushed, sucker punched, and every type of surprise attack known to man. And it happens in the dark. And I didn't really go over how this works exactly yet, but the torch in this game is not like a weapon.
Again, that's to add to that feeling of despair. And I think this area does it pretty well, actually. I think it does a good job of that.
That you could equip in one of your hand slots. It's just always on you, and you can only access it by going up to a fire source and then using the prompt to light it. Now, I could talk about the part where the torch forces you into a one-handed moveset.
Now, that of you always have the torch on you, but you need to light it. This is one of those things where it's a change for the sake of change, and it's more of a subjective, personal thing. And it's another aspect of the game where it adds realism, because in Dark Souls 3 you have a torch and it's just lit forever, but then you can throw it on your back and it automatically goes out, but then you one hand again and boom, it lights up again. And that's good for convenience, but it's not as good for realism, and Dark Souls 2 puts that heavier focus on realism, and I can understand that and I can appreciate that. I don't think that Joe understands that.
Which, again, sucks for large weapons because they clip through the environment and then get a damage debuff.
But that would trigger a primal rage from somewhere deep inside me.
So we're just going to focus.
That's just UGS bias. See, I personally am a normal greatsword wielder, like a claymore. And I don't have these problems. That's because greatswords are superior to ultra greatswords. Greatsword propaganda out of the way, we can move on.
On the fact that the torch mechanic doesn't even know what it wants to be. What I mean is that navigating a dark and spooky environment with all kinds of booby traps and ambushes is something that you're going to be doing slowly. It's a very deliberate and strategic style of play, and that would be fine if the torch didn't have a timer. If you pop open...
Alright, two things. One, the timer, not something I'm a fan of because I don't like consumables, I don't like limited resources. And so I understand where he's coming from on that, but I do appreciate that Dark Souls 2 did something different. Second thing is 4 hours, 32 minutes, 43 seconds. I don't care how slowly you go through an area. If it takes you 4.5 hours to go through a single area, like he says the torch is only a central part for 2 areas. Alright, cut that in half. 2 hours and 16 minutes and 21 seconds. If it's taking you 2 hours and 16 minutes and 21 seconds to get through a single area, you are the king of turtles. Because, wow, that is so slow. Like, 4.5 hours here? I've beaten the entirety of Bloodborne in 4.5 hours. Now, I skipped a good few areas, and it's a different game, but still. Like, 4.5 hours, that's plenty of time. And at the start of the game, I believe you start out with like 5 minutes, and that's not a whole lot, but you get more. And you can light a fire here and then put your torch out, go through the enemies until you get to the next fire, come back, light the fire, go to the next fire, light that. Like, not that big of a deal if you're running out of time. But you're probably not. You have plenty of time. So, not that big of a deal. Like I said, I'm not a fan of consumables. I'm not a fan of limited quantities of things. So, I definitely see where he's coming from. And I prefer, like, generally prefer the way torches are done in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. But the torch in Dark Souls 2 isn't oppressively low on time. It isn't unfair. It doesn't demand an unreasonable amount from you. I think it's fine. Even if I don't personally like it, I see what it was doing. It adds to the realism. I can appreciate that it adds to the realism. I can appreciate that they did something different. Even if it's not my cup of tea, I can understand it. I can appreciate it. This feels like more complaining for the sake of complaining.
your inventory, there is literally a timer for how long you could use a torch. Once it runs out, you have to wait for RNG to spawn another one on one of these enemy drops. So the game is telling you both to be slow and deliberate and to be fast and uncalculated at the same time, which is so on brand for this game because it makes no sense.
It demands a decent bit from you. Yeah, that's kind of how the entire series goes. It demands multiple, sometimes contradictory things from you. Like, especially early on in the game, you need to level up health, but you need to level up stamina, but you need to level up damage. But you don't have enough souls to level up all these things. So it's demanding different contradictory things from you. And then as you get later on, that gets smoothed out. Just as later on in Dark Souls 2, you get more time for the torch. So that gets smoothed out. So it's fine. It's not that big of a deal.
All right, my friends, that is everything I have to say about Dark Souls 2, minus all the stuff that you didn't hear because I cut it out so the video wouldn't be too long. Now, I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video, which is that Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game, which, honestly, after this overwhelmingly negative video, is kind of wild for me to be saying right now. But I really want to drive it home that this game is not a bad game, but it is the worst one of the Souls games. Because I think all the Souls games are some of the most amazing games of all time, I sort of think of Dark Souls 2 as the worst of the best. And I think I'm really backed up here with a lot of what I said in this video based on the fact
I think that's a good way to put it. It's the worst of the best. It's a good game, but it has a lot of problems, and it's just not as good as the rest of the series, and that's very noticeable, and that's very clear. Whether you're a novice, an intermediate player, or a veteran of the game and the series, that's something that I've seen myself, although I'm still a novice to Dark Souls 2, but it's something that I've heard from people who are intermediates, something I've heard from people who are veterans of the game, and I like to consider myself a veteran of the series, even if I don't have a lot of experience on Dark Souls 2.
that From Software abandoned all of the game mechanics that I put in the negative sections and then never went back to them. So there you have it. There's a really deep...
I mean, they quote-unquote abandoned them, but I feel like some of them should be brought back, and there's a lot of things from the positives that they didn't bring back, or only brought back in Elden Ring. But with that being said, that's the end of the video. That was Joe Gella. Don't know how to pronounce his name, but there's that. And I would suggest you to watch this on your own. It is Why Does Everyone Hate Dark Souls 2? I would suggest you watch it at your own pace. See what you agree with, see what you disagree with. Maybe leave him a comment. Just letting him know your opinions. Don't be mean. Even if you disagree with someone, you can still be pretty nice about it. You can still be polite about it. But, yeah, as I said, that's his video. I'm not planning on making React content be a normal, reoccurring thing. This is just a one-time only. And again, if I'm breaking any rules, please let me know. I know a bit about the rules, but not too much. But I don't think I'm breaking any. If I am, it's on accident. Please let me know, and I can try to get that fixed. But with that being said, yeah.